The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds as Flight 247 prepared for boarding at Denver International Airport. The experienced pilot adjusted her uniform cap and watched the passengers file in through the terminal windows. After 15 years in the cockpit, she could usually tell how smooth a flight would be just by observing the boarding process. Today, something felt different. "Hey Cap, weather report just came in," her co-pilot called out, handing her a freshly printed forecast. "Looks like we might hit some turbulence over Nebraska." She nodded, scanning the paper, when a commotion at the gate caught her attention. The gate agent's voice crackled over the radio, sounding tense. "Captain, we have a situation with a group of passengers." Through the window, she spotted them, 7 men in leather vests covered in patches, heavy boots thundering against the terminal floor. Their arrival sent ripples through the crowd as other passengers instinctively stepped aside. Even from a distance, their presence commanded attention, not just because of their appearance, but because of the way they moved, like wolves sizing up their territory. The pilot grabbed her radio. "What's the issue?" "They're being intimidating. But their tickets are valid, and they haven't technically broken any rules." She watched as they made their way down the jet bridge. The leader was a mountain of a man whose leather vest barely contained his massive shoulders. A prominent patch on his back displayed a medieval knight astride a motorcycle. Behind him, his companions followed in formation, each wearing similar vests with varying patches and insignias. As they boarded, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The flight attendants maintained their professional smiles, but their eyes told a different story. Regular passengers clutched their belongings closer, parents pulled their children nearer, and business travelers suddenly became very interested in their laptops. The pilot stepped out of the cockpit to observe the boarding process, a habit she developed over years of flying. The bikers spread out through the cabin rather than sitting together, an unusual choice that raised a red flag in her mind. Their voices carried across the cabin, just loud enough to be disruptive, but not quite enough to justify intervention. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" A young mother whispered as she passed, clutching her toddler's hand. The worry in her eyes reflected what many passengers were probably feeling. "Everything's fine," the pilot assured her with a warm smile. "We'll be taking off right on schedule." But something wasn't sitting right. In all her years of flying, she'd encountered plenty of motorcycle clubs on her flights. Most were respectful, often flying out to charity events or rallies. These men were different. Their patches looked new, almost too clean, and the way they positioned themselves throughout the cabin seemed calculated rather than casual. Back in the cockpit, she began her pre-flight checks, but her mind kept returning to the passengers. The lead flight attendant's voice came through on the intercom, higher pitched than usual. "Captain, we're ready for departure, but, well, there's been some tension during the safety demonstration." Looking through the cockpit window, she could see the ground crew giving final clearance. In a few minutes, they'd be airborne with these men for nearly 4 hours. Whatever was going on, they'd have to handle it at 35,000 feet. "Roger that," she replied, her voice steady and confident despite her growing concerns. "Keep me posted on any developments." As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, she caught snippets of conversation from the cabin, nervous whispers mixed with occasional loud laughter from the bikers. The contrast was jarring, like thunder on a clear day. The co-pilot glanced at her. "Think we should notify ground control about our interesting passengers?" She shook her head. "Not yet. Let's not escalate unless we have to." But she made a mental note of every emergency protocol they might need, every airport they could divert to if things went south. Years of experience had taught her that preparation was everything. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the morning sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would test everything she knew about handling difficult situations. The real question wasn't if something would happen, but when, and how she would need to respond when it did. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the bikers' voices getting louder, more insistent. The other passengers had fallen into an uneasy silence. 4 hours suddenly felt like an eternity, and they were only just beginning their ascent into what promised to be one of the most challenging flights of her career. 3 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin had grown heavy with tension. What started as uncomfortable glances and whispered concerns had evolved into something far more troubling. The bikers, strategically scattered throughout the plane, had begun their coordinated disruption with the precision of a well-rehearsed plan. The flight attendant in first class tried to maintain her composure as she served drinks, but her hands trembled slightly when she passed the massive biker with the skull tattoo. He'd asked for his third whiskey in the past hour, each time grabbing her wrist a little too firmly while making his request. Other passengers watched these interactions with growing unease, some pretending to sleep to avoid drawing attention. "Ma'am, could you please tell those men to quiet down?" An elderly gentleman in 14C whispered to a passing crew member, gesturing toward two bikers who were having an unnecessarily loud conversation across the aisle. "My wife is getting quite nervous." The flight attendant nodded sympathetically but knew the situation was more complex than a simple noise complaint. These men weren't just being loud. They were testing boundaries, watching how the crew and passengers reacted to each small provocation. In row 23, a businessman clutched his laptop bag closer as one of the bikers paced back and forth, supposedly heading to the bathroom for the 5th time. Each pass brought a new comment, a little more threatening than the last. "Nice computer you got there," he'd growl. "I'll bet that bag's worth more than my bike." A young mother near the back of the plane was fighting tears as she tried to calm her crying toddler. One of the bikers had been kicking her seat rhythmically for the past 20 minutes, claiming he had restless legs. When she'd politely asked him to stop, his response had been a cold stare and an increase in the frequency of kicks. The lead flight attendant made her way to the galley, where her colleague was already radioing the cockpit. "They're coordinating something," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Did you notice how they keep making eye contact with each other? And that hand signal the big one keeps making." Indeed, the biker with the skull tattoo had established himself as the ringleader. Every few minutes, he'd scratch his neck in what appeared to be a casual gesture, but immediately afterward, one of his companions would start a new disruption in a different part of the plane. In economy class, two of the bikers had started a heated debate about motorcycle brands, their voices growing louder with each exchange. The topic wasn't the issue, it was the threatening undertone, the way they leaned into the aisle, forcing other passengers to squeeze past them if they needed the bathroom. A teenage girl who'd been reading quietly by the window asked to change seats after one of the men spent 10 minutes staring at her without breaking eye contact. The flight attendants had to reshuffle several passengers to accommodate her request, all while maintaining a facade of routine service. The air marshal on board, traveling undercover, had noticed the pattern of escalation but held his position. Intervening too early could spark the very situation he was trying to prevent. Instead, he documented each incident, watching the systematic way these men were creating chaos. Near the emergency exit row, another biker had started questioning the passenger seated there about emergency procedures. "So, you're the one who's supposed to help if something goes wrong?" he asked repeatedly, his tone making it clear this wasn't casual conversation. "Wonder if you'd know what to do if something actually happened." The cabin crew exchanged worried glances as they performed their routine checks. They'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. These men weren't acting out randomly. There was purpose behind their actions, a methodical testing of every potential weak point in the aircraft's security. Hour 3 ticked by slowly, marked by more accidental bumps into passengers, more drinks demanded, more trips to the bathroom that seemed designed only to intimidate. The temperature in the cabin felt 10 degrees warmer than usual, heavy with the collective anxiety of passengers and crew alike. Through it all, the ringleader maintained his position in first class, watching the chaos unfold with an unsettling smile. His hand occasionally drifted to his vest pocket, drawing attention to something concealed there, a gesture that sent fresh waves of worry through those nearby. Just when the tension seemed ready to snap, one of the bikers made his move toward the cockpit during a bathroom break. He stumbled purposefully, using the motion to test the cockpit door's resistance. The click of the lock echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. In the galley, the lead flight attendant's hand hovered over the emergency signal button. 2 hours remained until landing, and everyone could feel that this was just the beginning. Whatever these men had planned, it was clear they were done with the subtle approach. The real test of everyone's courage was about to begin. The atmosphere in the plane shifted dramatically when the tallest biker made his move toward the cockpit. He'd timed it perfectly, right after the drink service when the flight attendants were busy collecting trash. His heavy boots echoed against the floor as he pushed past a startled passenger, claiming he needed to use the first-class bathroom. The co-pilot had just stepped out for a quick break, following standard procedures. The timing couldn't have been worse. Through the cabin camera feed, the pilot watched the scene unfold with growing concern. 143 souls on board, cruising at 35,000 feet, and help was still 2 hours away. The flight attendant's panic button flashed silently at her station. They'd been trained for situations like this, but training felt different from reality. Passengers sensed the change too. The cabin grew eerily quiet, except for a baby's soft crying somewhere in the back. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," the lead flight attendant called out, her voice firm despite her fear. The biker turned slowly, his leather vest creaking. The skull tattoo on his neck seemed to grin in the cabin's fluorescent lighting. "Just need to use the bathroom," he said, but his hand was already reaching for the cockpit door. Other passengers watched in frozen silence. A schoolteacher in row 3 held her breath. A businessman nearby reached for his phone, then remembered it wouldn't help at this altitude. The air marshal shifted in his seat, carefully assessing the situation. 6 other bikers were scattered throughout the plane, each watching intently. Any wrong move could trigger a coordinated response. The lead flight attendant's hand hovered over the emergency signal panel, ready to alert ground control. In the cockpit, the pilot faced a crucial decision. Standard protocol said to keep the door locked, maintain separation. But she could see the situation deteriorating through the security feed. The other bikers had started standing up, creating a pattern of movement that looked rehearsed. A young boy clutched his mother's arm, his eyes wide with fear. An elderly couple held hands tightly, their wedding rings glinting under the cabin lights. A college student removed her headphones, finally understanding why her roommate had been so tense. The biker's knuckles whitened as he gripped the handle of the cockpit door. "Last chance," he growled at the flight attendant. "Open it up." His free hand kept drifting to his vest pocket, implying a threat without explicitly making one. Through the cabin speakers, the co-pilot's voice crackled. All passengers must remain seated with seatbelts fastened. But several of the bikers were already standing, forming a loose perimeter around their leader. Their coordinated movements revealed military-style training. This was no ordinary motorcycle gang. Ground control's response to the silent alarm was still processing. At this speed and altitude, the nearest emergency landing strip was 45 minutes away. The pilot watched her cabin crew maintain their composure admirably, even as the situation spiraled toward chaos. A flight attendant dropped her serving tray, accidentally or on purpose, creating a momentary distraction. The loud clatter made several passengers jump. In that brief moment of confusion, the pilot saw her opportunity. The next few seconds would determine the fate of everyone on board. The ringleader had positioned himself squarely in front of the cockpit door, his massive frame blocking the narrow aisle. Behind him, his companions had created strategic choke points throughout the cabin. They'd planned this well, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed the pilot would follow standard protocol. As she reached for her radio to contact ground control, the pilot noticed something odd about the biker's patches. Years of experience had taught her to notice details, and something about these men didn't add up. Their leather vests looked too new, their patches too pristine. Real motorcycle clubs wore their colors with years of road wear, not fresh from a costume shop. The tension in the cabin had reached its breaking point. Passengers held their breath, flight attendants gripped their emergency procedures manuals, and the air marshal waited for the perfect moment to act. But before anyone could make a move, the pilot did something that would change everything. The pilot's next words caught everyone off guard. "That Harley-Davidson knucklehead engine you were bragging about earlier," she said to one of the bikers. "The timing sequence you described was completely wrong. No real mechanic would make that mistake." The cabin fell silent. Even the baby who had been crying earlier seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The pilot moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, her hands gesturing as she spoke about motorcycles with intimate knowledge. "Before I flew planes, I spent 10 years rebuilding vintage motorcycles," she explained, her voice carrying through the cabin. Started with a beaten-up Indian chief my uncle left me. Learned every bolt and bearing by heart. The passengers watched, fascinated, as their pilot transformed from authority figure to motorcycle expert. One of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand unconsciously touched the patch on his vest, a detailed motorcycle engine that, under scrutiny, showed obvious design flaws no real mechanic would display. The Steel Knights, the pilot continued, they're known for their charity rides. Every Christmas, they deliver toys to children's hospitals across 3 states. Their patches are earned through community service, not intimidation. She pointed to the crude skull design on the leaver's vest. They'd never wear death symbols. Their emblem is a knight's helmet with a dove. The ringleader's face had lost its menacing edge. His followers looked increasingly unsure, glancing at each other with growing uncertainty. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling under the weight of authentic knowledge. A businessman in the 3rd row, who had been cowering earlier, now sat up straighter. "I think I read about them in the paper," he called out. "The Steel Knights raised thousands for veterans last month." The pilot nodded, never taking her eyes off the imposters. "They did. Rode through 3 days of rain to make that event happen. Real riders, living the real code." She stepped closer to the leader, close enough to examine the stitching on his patches. "Your leather's not even broken in properly. No road wear, no oil stains. These vests came straight from a costume shop, didn't they?" Murmurs spread through the cabin as passengers began pointing out other inconsistencies. A truck driver in row 12 noticed their boots were too clean. A retired mechanic spotted problems with their supposed club rankings. The intimidating mystique that had held the cabin in fear was dissolving into embarrassment. "You know what gives you away the most?" the pilot asked, her voice carrying a hint of disappointment rather than anger. "Real motorcycle clubs have honor. They understand respect. The Steel Knights wouldn't stand for anyone using their colors to frighten innocent people." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, showing a photo of herself straddling a pristine vintage motorcycle. "This is my restored 1947 Indian. Still take her out on weekends when I'm not in the air. Any real biker would know this model by sight." The fake bikers stared at the photo, their expressions a mix of shock and dismay. The leader's tough guy persona had completely evaporated, replaced by the look of someone who realized they were thoroughly outmatched. A flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold approached with newfound confidence. "Captain, ground control reports the real Steel Knights have been notified. They're not happy about their reputation being misused." The passengers, who just minutes ago had been terrorized, now watched with a mixture of relief and fascination as their pilot continued to dismantle the imposter's charade with precise knowledge of motorcycle culture and mechanics. "So," the pilot said, addressing all 7 men, "would you like to tell us who you really are? Because you're not bikers. Real riders would never dishonor the culture like this." "And the Steel Knights?" She shook her head slowly. "They're going to want to have a long talk with whoever sold you those fake patches." Under the pilot's steady gaze, the truth began unraveling faster than a loose thread on a cheap leather vest. The leader's tough facade cracked like old paint, revealing something far different underneath. His hand, which had been nervously touching his vest pocket, finally pulled out what he'd been hiding, not a weapon, but a crumpled piece of paper. "We needed to divert the plane," he admitted, his voice barely carrying over the engine noise. "There's a shipment coming into Chicago. We were supposed to make sure this flight landed somewhere else." The paper turned out to be a hastily drawn map with coordinates marked in red ink. The other passengers listened intently, the cabin absolutely silent except for the steady hum of the engines. A young couple who'd been filming everything on their phones exchanged shocked glances. The air marshal moved closer, ready to act, but letting the pilot maintain control of the situation. "You bought the vests online," the pilot stated. It wasn't a question. "Probably found a tutorial about motorcycle club patches on some website. Thought it would be an easy way to scare people." She picked up one of the fallen patches. It had started peeling off, revealing the price sticker underneath. The youngest of the fake bikers, barely out of his 20s, couldn't hold back anymore. "It was supposed to be simple," he blurted out. "Create enough trouble to force an emergency landing. We didn't think anyone would know about real bikers." His voice cracked, showing just how amateur this whole operation had been. Phones were out all across the cabin now, recording every confession. A retired police officer in row 20 recognized the implications immediately. "They're not terrorists," he called out. "They're trying to help someone dodge a customs inspection in Chicago." The pilot nodded, the pieces fitting together. Using the Steel Knight's reputation to force a landing somewhere without proper customs facilities. Probably thought everyone would be too scared to question you. She held up the map. But real bikers don't do airport heists. That's straight out of bad movies. The leader sank into the nearest empty seat, his massive frame somehow looking smaller. "We were hired," he admitted. "Some guys needed their shipment to avoid inspection. Paid us to cause trouble, make it look like a motorcycle gang thing. Said nobody would look too closely at a bunch of bikers acting tough." Around the cabin, the other fake bikers had given up their acts entirely. One was nervously playing with his clip-on wallet chain. Another had already removed his vest, revealing a polo shirt underneath, hardly the attire of a hardened biker. "The real Steel Knights," the pilot explained to the cabin at large, "are probably already talking to the FBI. They take their reputation seriously. It's built on decades of community service and honest work." She turned back to the imposters. "You didn't just break the law, you insulted a brotherhood." The flight attendants had begun moving through the cabin, reassuring passengers and collecting statements. The air marshal finally stepped forward, officially identifying himself. But the threat had already been neutralized, not by force or weapons, but by knowledge and authenticity. "You want to know the biggest mistake you made?" the pilot asked, addressing all 7 men. "Real motorcycle clubs are about family, loyalty, and respect. They protect people, not terrorize them. By pretending to be something you're not, you disrespected not just the Steel Knights, but every rider who's ever earned their patches honestly." The truth had an unexpected effect on the cabin. Passengers who had been terrified now looked at the imposters with something closer to pity. The retired police officer was already explaining to nearby passengers how customs enforcement would handle this situation. "We're an hour from Chicago," the pilot announced. "I suggest you spend that time thinking about what you'll tell the real Steel Knights when they meet us at the gate. They're not just coming to protect their reputation, they're coming to show you what real bikers stand for." The wheels touched down at Chicago O'Hare right on schedule. Through the cabin windows, passengers could see a line of real motorcycles parked near the terminal, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. The real Steel Knights had arrived, their genuine patches visible even from a distance. As the plane taxied to the gate, the imposters sat quietly in their seats, their fake leather vests now folded on their laps. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we've come to a complete stop. And to our special guests, the actual Steel Knights would like to have a word with you about proper motorcycle etiquette." FBI agents were first through the door, moving with practiced efficiency. Behind them came 3 members of the real Steel Knights, their weathered leather vests telling stories of thousands of miles on the road. The contrast between their authentic appearance and the imposters' costume shop outfits was striking. The leader of the real Knights, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and battle-scarred knuckles, stopped to shake the pilot's hand. "Heard you know your way around a vintage Indian," he said with genuine respect. The pilot smiled, launching into a brief conversation about carburetors and valve timing that proved beyond doubt her deep knowledge of motorcycle mechanics. Passengers pulled out their phones again, but this time not out of fear. They wanted to capture the moment when real bikers showed what their culture truly stood for. The Steel Knights helped elderly passengers with their bags, gave high fives to amazed children, and demonstrated the genuine courtesy that was their trademark. "Your vests," the Knights leader said to the imposters as they were led away by FBI agents, "they tell a story. Our patches are earned through brotherhood, service, and respect. Each stitch represents a promise to protect, not intimidate. You didn't just fake our colors, you betrayed everything they stand for." The customs officials who arrived next were particularly interested in the crumpled map they'd found. It led them straight to a warehouse where a significant smuggling operation was waiting. The fake bikers' failed plan had unexpectedly helped law enforcement crack a much bigger case. The pilot stood in the cabin doorway, watching as real and fake bikers went their separate ways, one group to freedom and respect, the other to face justice. A young girl tugged at her uniform sleeve. "Can you tell me more about motorcycles?" she asked. "I think I want to learn to ride one someday." That's when the most unexpected thing happened. The Steel Knights leader overheard and turned back. "How about we give you and your family a tour of our charity workshop? Show you what real bikers do." The girl's eyes lit up as he explained their toy drive program and veteran support initiatives. One by one, passengers stopped to thank the pilot as they disembarked. The businessman who'd been terrified earlier pressed a business card into her hand. "My company supports veteran charities," he said. "Maybe we could sponsor the Knights' next toy drive." The final surprise came when the Steel Knights invited the pilot to lead their next charity ride on her vintage Indian. "Someone who knows bikes like you do, who stands up for what's right. You've already earned your place," the leader said, handing her an honorary patch. As the terminal cleared out, law enforcement finishing their reports and passengers heading to their destinations, one truth became clear. What had started as an attempt to exploit fear had transformed into a celebration of authenticity and community. The imposters had tried to use motorcycle culture as a weapon, but instead had revealed its true strength, the power to bring people together, to protect rather than intimidate, to serve rather than threaten. The pilot finally headed home, her new Steel Knights patch carefully folded in her uniform pocket. She knew that next weekend she'd be back on her beloved Indian, riding with people who understood what it really meant to be part of the brotherhood of the road. Sometimes, she reflected, the best way to handle fear isn't with more fear, it's with knowledge, authenticity, and the courage to stand up for what's right.